Thank you all for being here tonight. So I'll begin with a little story, or a story in two parts. As some of you know, and as Beth just alluded to, every year at Maybeck, the fall retreat and then moving into the year in general, we have a theme, except for when we decide to not have a theme, which happens sometimes too. So 6 years ago in 2019, our theme was, wouldn't you know it, artificial intelligence. And some of the workshops we offered that year, AI and science fiction, artificial consciousness, neural networks and facial recognition, self-driving cars, music and robots, the military and robots, and one called, presciently and rather cavalierly, You Might Not Have a Job. It was interesting enough, but it all felt hypothetical and all very far-fetched. So we watched the Pixar movie WALL-E, and afterward had an all-school discussion where we sort of talked fancifully about what it would be like when the real AI appeared, as opposed to what we had in Google Maps at that point. So fast forward 6 years. At the start of this school year, we spent time thinking about AI again. For an all-school activity on our final day, students were placed in groups representing different stakeholders and asked to advance an argument about AI from that perspective. Labor organizers and human rights activists, tech titans and environmentalists, high school students, and high school teachers. Groups then took turns presenting their findings to the school, and at the end of the day, gave input on what they thought Maybeck's philosophy regarding AI should be. Well, a very vocal contingent. I'm not sure if we can definitively say that it was a majority, but certainly a plurality, and it sure felt like a majority, was adamant and resolute that there is simply no ethical use of AI, period. I've told some of those students they should come here tonight and just go, boo! So pretty wonderfully, we have ended up this year at Maybeck in a place where there is considerable peer pressure among the students to not use AI. That students should be thinking and learning on their own, artists should be making their own art, et cetera. Which, when I talk about AI with teachers and professors at other schools around the country, they'll tell me they've had to move to in-class essays and recalibrate research assignments, and then they say, I mean, I'm sure you're seeing the same thing. And I have to be like, well. And while this is not a speech about what a special place Maybeck is, and of course I can't claim that none of our teachers here have had cause to suspect that a student may have used AI to complete an assignment, I do think that it's a helpful caveat, or maybe grain of salt, to add to everything that I'm about to say. So it's funny that I have become sort of the AI guy, because as our students will tell you, I don't allow computers, let alone phones, in the classroom. I barely know how to use the projectors in the classroom. My ideal teaching environment is just notebooks and pens, sitting in a circle around a table. For the things that I teach, at least, my feeling has long been that students' attentions are like moths drawn to light. If there's a screen in the classroom, you've lost them. Am I an AI expert? Far from it. I have only a cursory understanding of how LLMs work. I've never written a line of code in my life. AI enthusiast? AI booster? Lord, no. Am I AI curious? I think that comes closer, still not right. Maybe the best I can do is AI skeptic, in the original Greek sense, meaning inquiring or reflective. So Wikipedia says to search or to think about, relating to like spectacle or observing. So I am skeptical of others' skepticism, and I'm skeptical of others' zealotry. But I am interested in it. So let me just, again, sort of wall off the many considerations about artificial intelligence and predictions about how it is and will be impacting our world that I don't feel qualified to speak to, including, but not limited to, data centers, the invisible labor that is training neural networks, scraping and privacy of intellectual property, including my own, the identification of proteins enabling drug development, safeguards regarding mental health, et cetera. If AI is able to decode whale and dolphin language and allow us to communicate with our cetacean cousins, I will be psyched. If it destroys the cyber infrastructure that prevents our credit cards from all being hacked, I'll be bummed. What I do feel like I am qualified to consider is what it means for education, and in particular, the classroom experience. So that's what I'll be doing tonight. And I'll speak for a little while, and then we'll have time for questions and conversations at the end. So let me back up a little and account for how we got here, or at least how I got here. So I remember reading an article in the New York Times Magazine in April 22 about something called GPT-3 that had just learned to, if you gave it the first half of a paragraph, it could finish it in something approaching your style. That's crazy, thought I. So 6 months later, ChatGPT was released, and in a story I've since told many times, when I opened it up, the first thing I thought of was the lit paper, which is a long paper that's something of a rite of passage here at Maybeck, and an assignment that I've long thought of as unhackable. So I started plugging in pairs of books that those papers are based on and asked the machine to write me some essays. And as I watched the text materialize instantaneously, something that, I'll be honest, still amazes me every single time I do it, I remember thinking, this changes everything. It was just immediately clear to me how many systems and structures and standards wouldn't and still won't survive this transition. And at the same time, whatever havoc this was and is going to wreak across society, it would be an opportunity to start interrogating many of the things that we'd all sort of just like inherited as part of the educational system and ask which of these things are actually worth saving. So I ended up writing something in the Atlantic magazine about what AI might mean for the high school classroom that ended up being read by many, many people. Needless to say, nothing like that had ever happened to me before. And as Beth mentioned, I ended up being on the radio and various podcasts and also receiving lots of angry emails from people saying things like, "You're an idiot, you must be a terrible teacher." And a year or so later, I was asked to write a follow-up essay in the Atlantic, and not many people read that one, and my life went back to normal, smiley face. So if I'm being honest, what surprised me most from that experience is how quickly the responses flew immediately to the extremes. So many teachers asking, how can we just keep doing what we've always done? And students asking, how can we get away with not doing what they're asking us to do? And in the wake of those two questions, endless articles about bringing back blue books and never assigning take-home work again, and the cascade of AI detection software and the limitations and inequities of that software, and students, of course, making TikTok videos detailing the ever more ingenious ways of evading detection. And surely you have heard the absurd stories of teachers using AI to create essay prompts, and students using AI to write those essays, and teachers using AI to grade those essays. But having traveled around for the past few years, advising schools and departments about teaching with AI, I've seen the same pattern. Administrators telling students telling teachers either use AI everywhere immediately, or never let anyone use AI anywhere, but in neither case, actually giving teachers any guidance or training about how to do either of those things. And in my experience, teachers, they just want to be in the classroom, man. Like, they want to be in relationship with their students. They don't want to have to do endless grading or worry about AI. And we are annoyed that there's this new thing that we have to worry about and that they haven't received any guidance or support. They're annoyed that this onerous thing that they've always had to do, grading, now has this big, unknown, possibly dishonest thing that makes them feel like this might be just a huge waste of time. So this big strut has just been kicked away, making teachers really wonder about the usefulness of a lot of what they've always done. But I have to say, even now, 3.5 years later, the conversation seems not to have progressed very far from those initial responses. That is, the thinking about AI in the classroom flies immediately to those two extremes. Teachers asking, how can we stop the students from cheating? Students asking, how can we get away with cheating? But of course, this maps right onto the two extremes that guide the AI discourse more generally. Utopian fantasies and promises on one side, fear and aversion and doomsday scenarios on the other. These two, I admit, have a lot of gravitational pull to them. But there's this huge middle ground in between these two poles, and that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. And here's how I'd like to think about it. One thing that generative AI has done is allowed us to untangle some things that used to be deeply intertwined. Thinking, learning, writing, and reading. So I'm going to be considering those four things in turn. Thinking, learning, writing, and reading. So thinking. I'll begin on the safest terrain and say that AI is generally bad for thinking. It would just be so easy to outsource all your thinking to the chatbot. It's such a temptation. And of course, the tech companies are forcing it upon us absolutely everywhere. So thinking. Let's start with the basics. Being able to think for oneself, by oneself, to have the experience of thinking deeply, flexibly, and critically, to investigate your world and your experience is good and valuable and essential. It is literally one of the best and most important things in life. Not all thinking is beneficial, of course. I have lots of thoughts, habitual thoughts, self-critical thoughts, thoughts of ill will toward other people or whatever, that do not do me any good. So of course it depends on what kind of thinking we're talking about. If I'm thinking about taking a trip or thinking about trying to make a soup with the random things in my fridge, AI can be amazingly helpful. But I'd say that that's more like deciding. Some of those decisions I am quite happy to unload or offload to AI. Seriously, the next time that you plan a vacation, try using AI to build your itinerary. It is a revelation. But if we're talking about school, if a student told me, oh, I couldn't think of what to do my project on, so I asked ChatGPT for some ideas, I would say that that's terrible. Or I couldn't remember any examples from the text, so I asked ChatGPT where to look. Again, no. I'm sure many of you have heard this term, productive struggle. It's from math education research. Our calculus teacher, Yesenia, talks about it a lot. It's not struggle for the sake of struggle. That would be stupid. But productive struggle, engaging in a cognitively demanding task that leads to growth and transformation, is an extraordinary thing. For high school students, of course, this doesn't go without saying. They are navigating, some of you are, navigating the never-ending cavalcade of assignments. It's pretty natural to just make them want to go away. So it's on us as teachers to prove to them, to convince them that they don't actually want to take the easy way out, that walking 1.5 miles is, instead of driving, actually worth the time and effort. There's a guy at Harvard, his name is Arthur Brooks, and he argues that happiness has 3 main components: enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. Enjoyment, satisfaction, meaning. At its best, that's what the classroom environment can be. We're in a safe, pleasant space, there's nice people around, doing something challenging and rewarding, and coming away feeling differently about ourselves and our place in the world. I heard a teacher say recently, making things easier impedes learning. I'm not sure I really agree with that. Surely I want to explain concepts as clearly as I can and not be deliberately abstruse, for example, using words like abstruse. But in this context, I think it makes sense. It's like the old Robert Frost line, the only way out is through. Figuring things out is hard. Writing papers is hard. It's so tempting to look for a shortcut or an end around, but I think we all know, for any challenge, the only possibility for real growth lies in engaging it directly. So what does this look like in practice? Let me give you one quick example. So there's this beautiful essay by Richard Rodriguez called Late Victorians, and Bill Welp originally introduced me to it. It's a little hard to track down, but well worth your time if you can find it. So it's about San Francisco and gay domesticity and the HIV/AIDS epidemic and weightlifting and architecture and lots of things. Here's how it begins. St. Augustine writes from his cope of dust that we are restless hearts, for earth is not our true home. Human unhappiness is evidence of our immortality. Intuition tells us we are meant for some other city. Elizabeth Taylor, quoted in a magazine article of 20 years ago, spoke of cerulean Richard Burton days on her yacht, days that were nevertheless undermined by the elemental private reflection, this must end. So my students and I are in class, sitting around the table, writing in our notebooks, and I ask 2 questions. First, what do you think this means? And we take 5 minutes to respond in our notebooks. And then, what would you need to know in order to understand this better? And we take 5 more minutes. Depending on the student, they might not know who St. Augustine is, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, what cerulean means, cope of dust, maybe even elemental. So then we take out our computers gasps around the room, always. And I ask them to open a chatbot of their choice. And here I feel compelled to mention that Maybeck students on occasion will refuse to do this part, but in this scenario, let's assume that they relent. And each student pastes in those 2 paragraphs that I just read and asks the chatbot, what do you think this means? So to pull back the curtain a little bit, my intention with this exercise is to first give them an opportunity to confront the limits of their own knowledge and understanding, and then essentially let them put their own knowledge and understanding on steroids. So with the AI, I give them 5 more minutes about to go back and forth with it, ask follow-up questions, push back, maybe asking it to be more concise or less flowery or whatever. And I ask them to keep going until they come up with something that they feel like they can get behind or something that they feel good about. And I ask for volunteers, and we share a few of those aloud. And then we put away our computers again, and we spend a few more minutes back writing in our notebooks, reflecting on what that process was like. Was it satisfying, annoying, illuminating, whatever? Without exception, every single person that I've done this with, both students and teachers, said that they preferred writing in notebooks. That even if there was stuff that they didn't understand, it felt good to grapple with the ideas, to sit with the syntax on their own. And that when they opened up the computer, they started feeling gross. So what it ends up being is an activity intended to empower students in collaborating with AI and prepare them for this world that they are arriving into, while also, far more importantly, persuading them that they don't actually need to do it. Okay, so that's thinking. Now I'm going to, as it were, cross the partisan aisle and talk about learning. Learning. This is maybe my most controversial take, but I would say that AI is unquestionably beneficial for learning. I think the best way to consider learning is with a few examples. And before you say, but Daniel, it makes things up. Yes, it makes things up. So the technical term most of you probably know is that AI hallucinates. So what I do, just as a general rule of thumb, when the AI tells you something, you can just ask it, are you sure? And usually, if it's right, it'll say, yes, definitely, I'm sure. If it's not sure, sometimes it'll say, actually, you're right, I made that up. And then it'll correct itself. Or you can ask it to name its sources, and then you can go to the source and see if it's actually accurate. Another thing you can do is ask a different AI the same question. And then if they have the same answer, you're on pretty stable footing. Okay, so examples. First, a simple one. I use AI to help my daughter with her math homework. So she comes to me with her homework, and it's way too hard for me because she's in 7th grade, and she is graphing inequalities with negative variables. So I just tell the chatbot, help me understand this. Don't tell me the answer, but ask questions to guide me through it. Super helpful, and to be frank, good for my relationship with my daughter. It can aid comprehension. One thing that AI can do incredibly well is take really difficult language and simplify it or put it into everyday speech. This is one reason why people think that it might put a lot of lawyers out of work. Of course, SparkNotes and No Fear Shakespeare have been doing this for 2 decades. But again, a student can paste in a difficult paragraph about macroeconomics or dinoflagellates, ask for another way to, is it flagellates or flagellates? Let's say flagellates. Ask for another way to put it in different words, and then, crucially, go back to the original text, feeling more confident about what they're reading. So a more interesting example. A few years ago, I was reading a book by Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian writer and Nobel laureate, about the fall of the Soviet Union. And early on in the book, I kept coming across this word, perestroika. And I was like, I think I know what that means. I remember that from when I was a kid, but I'm not really sure. So I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it gave me the sort of dry Wikipedia answer. And in particular, you know how Wikipedia is often like a jumble of other technical terms that you would need to know in order to understand the definition? CPSU, glasnost, era of stagnation. So I asked the chatbot, and at first that gave me a pretty dry Wikipedia answer too. So instead I said, write me a little story about a day in the life of an average Russian citizen and how perestroika would have affected their world. And here are 2 paragraphs from the middle. On Dimitri's walk to the metro, he stopped at the state grocery store out of habit. The shelves were thinner than they used to be. Bread, yes, butter only sometimes. The shortages had gotten worse lately, and people grumbled about it, openly now in ways they might not have a few years ago. Gorbachev had a word for what was happening, perestroika, restructuring, and it was on everybody's lips, though nobody could quite agree on what it would mean for their lives. Near the market, his neighbor Volkov had set up a small shoe repair stall, quietly at first, then more confidently once the new cooperative laws passed. Legal now. A man working for himself, keeping his own earnings. Some of the older men in the building shook their heads. Dimitri's father would have too, but the stall was always busy. So speaking very generally, there are two main ways that we remember things: repetition and emotional connection. Repetition, emotional connection. So here, this little story helps me feel emotionally connected to other human beings, gives me a concrete illustration to remember and hold on to. Not only that, but now I'm interested in digging further, see how it affected the situation more broadly, why the economic reforms didn't work, etc. Another example. Let's say that I'm in high school and I'm studying for a biology exam, and I'm having a hard time understanding the different parts of a cell. So I asked the AI to write me an analogy with each component representing a member of a family. So it writes, apologies, this is a little heteronormative. The nucleus, mom. Mom is the one actually running everything. She holds all the important documents, DNA, makes the rules, and sends out instructions to everybody else. Nobody does anything major without checking with her first. Mitochondria, dad. Dad keeps the lights on. He's always in the garage converting food into energy, ATP, so the rest of the family can function. When he's stressed, he can even trigger the whole household to shut down. Apoptosis. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Ribosome, the kids. There are thousands of them. They're everywhere. And they're constantly making things, proteins in their case. They follow mom's instructions, mRNA, without fully understanding why. Golgi apparatus, grandma. Grandma receives everything the kids make, inspects it, checks its status, packages it up nicely, and ships it off to the right destination, either inside the house or out the door. A few more examples, a bit more abstract. So I'm teaching civics this year for the first time in 7 years, and over the summer I assembled this course anthology with all the texts that we would be reading over the course of the semester. It's 250 pages long, all the way from the Articles of Confederation to Ida B. Wells, from Emma Goldman to the Supreme Court decisions from the past few appalling years. I'd guess over the summer it took me about 100 hours to put this thing together, doing research, falling down myriad rabbit holes, etc. When I was finished, right before I sent it off to the copy shop to have it printed, I pasted in the table of contents to an AI program and asked it if there was anything notable missing, anything egregious that I'd left out. And it said, this looks good, but you might want to include Harvey Milk's Hope speech, and how about this short speech by Queen Mother Audley Moore about going to see Marcus Garvey with, quote, 2 guns with me, 1 in my bosom and 1 in my pocketbook, little 38 specials. It wasn't hallucinating. And as it happens, my students will be reading both of these texts for tomorrow morning's class, and I would have forgotten them both if it hadn't been for the technological assistance. Okay, one more example about learning. Last year, I learned a term called hapax legomenon. Hapax legomenon. A hapax legomenon is a word that only occurs once in a given text. So the word comes from ancient Greek, and it literally means only said once. So one famous example from the Hebrew Bible is gopher, referring to the wood that God specifies must be used to build Noah's Ark, and no one has any idea what kind of tree gopher wood comes from. So one day I was reading something about Moby-Dick, and came upon this claim that 44% of the set of distinct words in Moby-Dick appear only once and are thus hapax legomena. Despite being 250,000 words long, Melville managed to use a unique word every 12 words. So I thought, wow, I'd love to see that list. So I did some digging, and I couldn't find the list anywhere. All I found were various places repeating that same fact, on Reddit, on Twitter. So I uploaded the full Moby-Dick text into chat, and in about 10 seconds, it made me a full list from abandonedly to Zephyr, and just in the uns, uncatastrophed, uninterpenetratingly, unensanguined, meaning not covered in blood, unloitering, meaning moving quickly, and untattooed, meaning, not tattooed. But then I thought, wait, I still don't understand. How is this a unique word every 12 words? Is it just because there are lots of thes and ands and ofs in the book? And the AI said, yes, this is actually a well-studied phenomenon called Zipf's law. In any large body of text, a tiny number of words account for the vast majority of usage. And the most common word appears roughly twice as often as the second most common, 3 times as often as the third, and so on. It's a remarkably consistent pattern across language, and no one knows why. Language, and that's not just English, all languages. No one knows why. So the picture in Moby-Dick is something like this is not me, I'm still quoting the AI. So the picture in Moby-Dick is something like 2 overlapping worlds. A small core of maybe 100 to 200 words that appear hundreds of thousands of times each, the, and, of, whale, ship, sea, man, one, and a vast periphery of 17,000 plus words that flash into existence once for a specific tool, a specific mood, a specific creature, and are never needed again. Which is almost a metaphor for the book itself, honestly. There's the obsessive, churning repetition of the whale hunt at the center, and then all this strange, sprawling, encyclopedic material radiating outward that you encounter once and never return to. End quote. I mean, come on, that is pretty good. Okay, so let's turn to writing. Writing. This is the trickiest one, or rather, this is where generative AI has been and will prove to be most disruptive to education. And I would honestly be surprised to hear anyone disagree with that. 5 years ago, I would have told you that writing is an absolutely essential skill, uncompromisable. Everyone needs to know how to write. Now I would say writing is a tool or a technology, a wonderful, powerful technology. Rather than thinking about it as an essential skill that we need to learn to survive, weaving baskets or building a fire, how to use a credit card, we should think of writing as a powerful way to learn, to explore a concept, to reflect on our thinking, to organize and express complex ideas. If students like doing it, great. I do too. But can I tell them, in a world of TikTok and Instagram Reels, that learning how to craft a beautiful paragraph is more important than practicing video editing? I cannot. I cannot tell them that. Can I tell them even more crucially that writing, as opposed to creating a super powerful video, would be the most effective means to organize and create solidarity and affect meaningful change in this world? I cannot tell them that either. Anatomically modern humans have been around for about 300,000 years. And there's evidence it's way, way longer than that. Writing was invented 5,000 years ago. So for 98.3% of all human history, people have been thinking and expressing themselves and communicating in extraordinarily different and complex ways all over the world without ever having heard of writing. Even within the past 5,000 years, most people have been unable to write, in part because people were intentionally prevented from learning how to write because it's such a powerful tool for liberation. There's a passage that I really love from Jill Lepore's book, These Truths. To write something down doesn't make it true, but the history of truth is lashed to the history of writing like a mast to a sail. Writing was invented in 3 different parts of the world at 3 different moments in time, about 3200 BCE in Mesopotamia, about 1100 BCE in China, and about AD 600 in Mesoamerica. In the history of the world, most of the people who have ever lived either did not know how to write, or, if they did, left no writing behind, which is among the reasons why the historical record is so maddeningly unfair. To write something down is to make a fossil record of a mind. Stories are full of power and force. They seethe with meaning, with truths and lies, evasions and honesty. Speech often has far more weight and urgency than writing, but most words, once spoken, are forgotten while writing lasts. And there are plenty of examples in many places around the world of people being really skeptical of writing, that it would destroy the oral traditions, the heart of those cultures, that putting things down in writing somehow corrupts what's being communicated. I remember when I published that first article in The Atlantic, someone wrote me an angry email that said, "Writing is at the core of what it means to be a human being." Forgive me, but no, it isn't. It's a technology. Again, it's a really wonderful way to manage to grab hold of an idea, move it around, explore it, shape it, really figure out what you're trying to say. But there are other ways to do that too. A debate, a presentation, a map, a song. It's also, perhaps more saliently, really useful for assessing student learning and having things to grade. So in most of my classes, we spend most of our time writing. As I alluded to earlier with the Richard Rodriguez passage, I ask questions, we all write responses in spiral notebooks, including me, and then we share our writing aloud, so all voices are held equally. This is the basic structure of the writing-based classroom, first put forth by Peter Elbow, taught at Bard College's Institute for Writing and Thinking, and that I learned from Bill Webb. So I set out the ground rules. No preface, no apology, no explanation, no summary. The goal is to read what's on the page and only what's on the page in all of its messiness and imperfection, rather than describing or summarizing what's on the page. I try to tell them, try to believe that what is on the page will be useful to other people in the room, something I learned from another friend, Jeff Berger-White. It may not be what you planned to say or what you'd said if you'd had a half hour to revise it, but this is what came out, and that's what we're interested in. As my friend Dave Rutschman at the Berkeley Zen Center says, it may not be predictable, but that doesn't mean that it's arbitrary. This is writing at its absolute best. Everyone is good at it. Everyone. There aren't any rules. They don't have to worry about comma splices or run-on sentences. Each person is immediately their original self. Just like when you get a text from someone, they have their own inimitable voice, and they use that to express something about themselves or the text or the world. And an unspoken secret about this kind of pedagogy is that it isn't intended to improve writing, but learning. But by doing it every day, day after day, they end up becoming better writers as a result. So the problem often arises when we move to quote unquote formal writing, and then students feel like they have to write fancy, and their writing almost uniformly gets worse. But more on that in a moment. So in the classroom, we do various kinds of writing. We do free writing, where we write whatever comes up, whatever it is. Generative writing, where we're responding more pointedly to a given text or an idea. And then process writing, or metacognitive writing, where we are reflecting on our own thinking or what we heard other people say in the room. AI doesn't touch any of this. Even more than that, quoting the New York Times now, the scientific research on the benefits of so-called expressive writing is surprisingly vast. Studies have shown that writing about oneself and personal experiences can improve mood disorders, help reduce symptoms among cancer patients, improve a person's health after a heart attack, reduce doctor visits, and even boost memory. I'll tell you about something that happened in my class just 2 days ago. Listening to this group of seniors read aloud responses to an essay by Megan Ajiblin. Their writing was so beautiful, so honest, and thoughtful and brave. And it was obvious that the writing that they had done in that room had only arisen because the trust that they had with each other, the culture that they had created through writing together as a group day after day over the course of a few months. So speaking of Megan Ajiblin, she wrote this book a few years ago. I highly recommend it. It's called God, Human, Animal, Machine. Her name is a little bit hard to remember, but God, Human, Animal, Machine. There's this passage where she writes, "From the earliest days of AI, the goal was to create a machine that had human-like intelligence. Alan Turing and the early cyberneticists took it for granted that this meant higher cognition. A successful, intelligent machine would be able to manipulate numbers, solve complex theorems, and in particular, beat a human in chess. When, in 1996, IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, a famous cognitive scientist, told the New York Times, 'My God, I used to think chess required thought. Now I realize it doesn't.'" So today, almost 30 years later, the greatest chess player in the world is named Magnus Carlsen, and he's maybe the greatest chess player of all time. It is generally assumed that if he played the most advanced chess engine 100 times, he would lose 99 of those games and maybe play the AI to a draw once. Because that's what computers are really, really good at: data and calculations. What the computer can't do, and this is something that Hubert Dreyfus, beloved and recently deceased professor at Cal, and one of the first writers on artificial intelligence, and also one of the great readers of Moby-Dick, he was arguing, starting back in the 70s, that computers would never be able to experience, to know what it's like to be a thing, to have a body, to have a mind. And this is why I still play intermediate level blitz chess games on my phone, because it's fun, no matter what an AI can do or how well it can play. So who cares if in 5 years the chatbot can write as well as Joan Didion, and if the next Silicon Valley gold rush is personal writing assistants that let you never have to write another email. In my classes, at least, we will still be writing something that can be called an essay, taking our in-class writing and seeing where they've been and where it leads them. Since, as my students are very, very tired of hearing me repeat, the word essay means to test out, to try, to attempt, to grapple, to weigh. At the same time, for me personally, I think this gives us permission to care way, way less about things like in-text citations and perfect spelling and perfect apostrophe use. If the computer can do those things for us, great, God bless, who cares? If I could go back and get back the countless hours that I've spent trying and failing to get kids to use apostrophes properly, I'd have watched way more of the TV shows that I've completely missed out on. But there's no question, this is an opportunity to change what we in school think the essay is. When you think about it, it's pretty weird that the standard thing to do is to spend all this time in a classroom having this beautiful shared experience with other human beings, and then the culminating assignment is for everyone to retreat to their separate silos and write a paper about why their interpretation of things is correct. And in an insight that I stole from Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator, which, irony of ironies, gave birth to OpenAI, the history of the essay is wrapped up with the history of the university in Europe, and how they were originally more like law schools than anything else, which is why it makes sense that a persuasive essay is pretty much exactly like the closing argument in a court case. After all, this is the last thing, isn't it weird how you're expected to graduate high school being able to perform this one very, very specific task of all the forms contained within the universe of writing? Not a haiku or a sonnet or a short story, but an analytical essay about The Great Gatsby with a thesis statement. A few years ago, I heard Alfie Guy, who's the director of undergraduate writing at Yale, say that in 10 years, he doesn't think students will be asked to write analytical essays anymore, that academics will still write them, but that it'll no longer be considered a way to demonstrate student learning. Again, all of these things are made up. One day they will change and go away, and that time may be now. So before I move on to the last thing I'm going to talk about, I'll summarize this part by sharing a couple excerpts from this thing that I put together a few years ago that I called 3 Principles for Dealing with the Impact on generative AI on Writing Assignments. So the first thing is in-class writing. To prioritize the classroom experience as something that is intrinsically meaningful, beneficial, collaborative, and shift emphasis from product, traditional essay, to process, in-class writing. Because students who have already invested a really good deal of time and effort engaging with the text in class will be less likely to go to generative AI because they're just staring at a blank page. So designing assignments that force them to use extemporaneous writing as the seed of something longer often jumpstarts a student's sense of buy-in and sense of ownership with larger assignment. Number 2, personal connection. Students who have had opportunities to write about themselves and their relationship with a text or a topic and or their experience with this material will be less likely to look to AI to do their work for them. I have to say, it's funny, Bill, I remember 10 years ago, you saying, of course they can use I in an essay. And I'm like, no, they cannot use A in an essay. Anyway, third thing, open-mindedness. Don't make or try to make AI completely off limits. This technology does offer opportunities to facilitate or even enhance student learning. Just as importantly, it is not going away. Ask students to be honest about if and how they're using AI and other technologies. Discuss with them creative ideas for engaging with generative AI. And honestly, considering what most teachers I've heard are dealing with, if the worst case scenario, if students take their in-class writing, type it into ChatGPT and say, turn this into an essay, I'd call that a win. At the very least, as Michelle Hoffman at Bard has written, cheating is the wrong starting point for how we respond to AI. Our priority must be to protect thinking and learning, not our assessments. Policing AI use creates cultures of suspicion that many teachers deeply lament. If there is a culture of judgment, shame, or silence around AI, students will likely still use it and hide it. Okay, so finally we have reached the fourth and final of our verbs for tonight, and that is reading. Reading. Reading remains, if you ask me, almost entirely untouched by generative AI. For over a decade now, I have heard teachers and professors at conferences and on the New York Times op-ed page claim that kids today can't read books anymore. Their attention spans are too fried by watching videos with Subway Surfer playing in the corner. And I was tearing my hair out about it in 2013, and I'm tearing my hair out about it now. So every year I teach this senior seminar where we spend the semester reading Moby-Dick. We take 9 weeks to do it, all 600 pages. Every week, students have to submit a creative response project. They write poems, they draw pictures, they compose songs, they make interpretive dances. Last semester, one student made clam chowder. And in class, we write, we talk, we spend a lot of time just reading aloud. Sometimes I read aloud if I want it to sound a particular way. Other times we pass it around the room, seeing what it's like to try to wrap our mouths around Melville's long, winding sentences, alliteration, arcane allusions. We practice reading. And then for the final project, they do in-class presentations, leading their classmates in discussion. So in that class, it is possible to go the entire semester without doing any formal writing at all, despite it being an English class. If I had to guess, I would say maybe 1 or 2 students a year don't finish the entire thing. Not to say some of them aren't skimming on occasion, because at times the book is really boring. So over the years, let's say that 90% of the students have finished one of the most famously unfinishable books ever written. And I'm connected with a number of teachers around the country who also teach Moby-Dick, also unabridged, at public schools and private schools, who would tell you the same thing. So last fall, I taught Moby-Dick to 16 seniors, and most of them are presently this semester in another one of my classes. I swear they bring it up almost every class. They want to talk about Moby-Dick all the time. They remind me of things that I've forgotten. They make connections that I would never have imagined the thing that we're reading right then. They have gotten way more out of the book than I did the first time that I read it when I was 26. So spare me the doomsdaying about Gen Z or Gen Alpha or whatever we're on now. The average teenager encounters more text on a given day than any of us did in our youth. I've seen studies that suggest young people today consume a book's worth of words every single day between texts and posts and closed captioning on TikTok videos. Obviously, that word consume is doing a lot of work here. High volume, shallow reading is nothing like the close reading that teachers expect students to do in a classroom. But if young people are good at that sort of shallow reading, it's because they're practicing it. So again, it falls to us to give students the opportunity to build the habit, to practice and cultivate the skills of sustained reading and, frankly, a tolerance of boredom. And again, to persuade them that books are worth their time. But for now, I guess that I've ended in sort of a binary. In some classes, using AI as a support can be extraordinarily helpful. In others, not only would it not be beneficial, it's just beside the point. So just a few days ago, I read this new poem by Victoria Chang, and it goes like this. There is a bird and a stone in your body. Your job is not to kill the bird with the stone. I'll read it again. There is a bird and a stone in your body. Your job is not to kill the bird with the stone. When I read that, I want to keep AI as far from me as possible. There's nothing it can do. It can only get in the way. This is the kind of experience and the kind of reading that I want to really insist on and champion and celebrate. And the flattening of our media landscape, where literature has lost the centrality of its position as uniquely rich, and instead placed alongside video games and anime as just another form of entertainment, another way to spend our time, I will argue is really worth working to resist. As usual, James Baldwin expressed this best. You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. End quote. So now we have reached the end of the talk, and as I was writing this, I was feeling the weight of saying something, as the rhythm of this sort of talk usually goes, prescriptive, like here's what we can all do, or here's why it's all going to be okay. But of course, I'm not in a position to say anything like that. The individuated attention and support that I've described above is not going to be possible at many schools, at least not without major civic reform, which of course is unlikely in this time under this administration. Spiritual growth is hard to assess and impossible to find metrics for and not represented on the SAT. A useful way that I've found to think about generative AI is that it's allowed us to think differently about process and product. So process and product. And as I've said, the education system has for decades been pretty uniformly focused on product, helping students build the skills so they can perform the task, create the product. Can you pass the test? Can you write a 5-paragraph essay? Can you define the terms? Can you measure this angle? Well, now we have a machine that can do anything, everything. So how can we possibly just continue on with a system that measures achievement based on the delivery of product? Again, it's not yet clear what things are going to survive this transition from AP tests and SATs to data entry and market analytics. And most of those things I cannot speak to, but as far as education goes, where this leaves us is, again, this profound opportunity to look at what the point of any of this is. Alison Gopnik, again, a half-mile north of here at Cal, will tell you that all children are little scientists, little philosophers. Everyone is born with an innate desire to learn, to explore, to investigate their world. So I'd say it's on us as teachers to convince our students that what we're asking them to do is worth their time. And I want to powerfully argue for the inherent benefit of being in a room together, being in a room with other people, making meaning together. This looks different in different ways, of course. Figuring out a problem, exploring an idea, listening to different voices, hearing different perspectives, having the experience of practicing and experimenting, being vulnerable, kind, and supportive. Again, being in a room, making meaning together. That's what it's all about.